Chapter 2. 3. Lacking the restless curiosity and lively imagination and inventiveness of the Greek, the Roman methodically copied his enemy's weapons when these proved superior, and even his tactics to a degree. On strategy, the Roman remained weak. Perhaps his most characteristic military solutions were his army camp and his naval warfare. A Roman army on the march constructed each night a square camp, fortified by a moat and a palisade of stakes, and the army laid out inside the protected area streets crossing each other at right angles. Every soldier occupied the same tent on the same street, regardless of where or when the camp was built. Each camp was a sort of temporary Rome. It was unlikely to be taken by surprise. Any sentry who slept was clubbed to death by his fellow soldiers. If the army left camp for battle and was threatened with destruction, it could be withdrawn to Rome with minimal confusion. It could, even at night. Polybius, a Greek historian of Rome's rise to power, attached great importance to this simple device, time-consuming and exhausting as it often was, for the Romans did not adapt Rome to the terrain as the Greeks adapted their camps, but even graded off a hilltop if necessary. Again, in the first war with Carthage, Rome faced a leading sea power. Rome was neither a trading nor a naval power, but the Romans found a wrecked Carthaginian ship, built a considerable fleet on this model, used an iron grappling hook to draw the enemy alongside it when in battle, boarded and fought as infantry. And this centuries after the Athenian admiral Cannon had used the most brilliant naval tactics for ramming and sinking the enemy. Of course, once Rome controlled Magna Graecia and Sicily, her forces could draw on Greek shipwrights, Greek engineers, Greek surgeons, and their crews. And although on land she failed to develop Roman cavalry as a striking force to break enemy infantry, she did require her allies to furnish cavalry contingents. Rome herself focused on holding the line with disciplined foot soldiers, even against enemy cavalry. Her consuls served as amateur generals and often for only 1 year, their legal term of office. They nearly always showed a lack of imagination that sorely crippled strategy, but the same lack of imagination helped a line of infantry, even if badly mauled, to hold. In short, Rome counted on no clever maneuver by either horse or ship to impose her will. She counted on disciplined, tenacious infantry who knew how to apply force. The Romans, Polybius wrote, to speak generally, rely on force in all their enterprises and think it is incumbent on them to carry out their projects in spite of all, and that nothing is impossible when they have once decided on it. No one was more aware than Polybius that the Greeks had often exploded into violence, or that they had all but wrecked the Hellenic world with the violence of the Peloponnesian War. Nobody was probably more aware than this cultivated Greek of how cynically the Athenians, as quoted or paraphrased in a famous dialogue of Thucydides' history, had given the Melians a choice of submitting to force or facing utter ruin. But Polybius was talking neither of explosions nor cynicism, but of the cold, methodical reliance the Romans placed on force in all their enterprises, and their voluntaristic preference for decisions and tenacity as against inquiry and listening. But perhaps Rome's most powerful weapon was the one Dido hated in Aeneas, the one which perhaps kept his goddess mother from risking a conversation with him: self-righteousness. The epithet Virgil most frequently prefixes to the name of his epic hero is pious, God-fearing. Jove had commissioned him to found a city that would lay down the law. He commissioned him to lead a saving remnant westward across the sea, out of a city that Greek cleverness and Greek duplicity had destroyed. The saving remnant continued to fight its way westward, for they not only pushed Carthage out of Sicily and tricked her out of Corsica and Sardinia, they even broke the power of the Gauls, the Celtic tribesmen who had held the Po Valley, the most extensive agricultural area of Italy. They later allied themselves with the Greek city of Marseille and fought the Gauls and Germans in southern France. And in a second war with Carthage, they wrested from her the empire she was building in southern Spain to replace her lost holdings in Sicily. Even Rome's thrust westward continued to the sea until she held what was now Spain, Portugal, France, and Germany, and the Low Countries as far as the Rhine, England as far as the Scottish border, and a bit beyond. The winning the West involved hard warfare against tough barbarians, and it took duplicity and betrayals and broken treaties as well as courage to win. By the time Julius Caesar and Augustus between them had replaced republican government with a military autocracy and founded the Roman Empire, a goodly part of the barbarous West had been won. It was won by the descendants of that saving remnant which, according to Virgil, had itself fled western across the sea. By the time Rome had won the West and had entered what she had called for centuries the Gallic peril, she had already turned eastward and had liberated the Greeks in the Balkan Peninsula, in Asia Minor, in Syria, and in Egypt, and she had once liberated the Greeks of Sicily from Carthage. In the Hellenistic East, of course, Rome no longer dealt with barbarians, but with a people who regarded Romans themselves as half barbarian. As for Rome's reaction to this half-concealed scorn, she distrusted what she considered the easy morals of the Greeks, their religious skepticism and their lack of tenacity, their love of abstraction and philosophic argument, their failure to build a common political community, whether under Athenian leadership or Spartan or Theban or Macedonian. Above all, perhaps, she disliked their fatal leanings towards democracy with its constant threats to redistribute property. Yet charmed by the grace and graciousness of this older world, some few Roman patricians, for example, the Scipios, learned Greek and found Greek tutors for their sons. In Sicily, Scipio the Elder and the future conqueror of Hannibal even wore Greek clothing in public instead of proper Roman toga. Cato the censor promptly denounced him as un-Roman. In Rome, this was a grave charge. Indeed, one Latin word, mores, meant both customs and morals, for Romans revered the customs of their ancestors as defining the Roman way of life. Scipio the Younger made a Greek hostage. Polybius, the historian, his mentor, and Polybius records that at the sack of Carthage, Scipio wept, reflecting a startlingly un-Roman fashion at the turn of eternal Rome, that un-Roman fashion, that the turn of eternal Rome would one day come, that successful Rome would also one day fail. But of course Scipio was Hellenized and understood something of Hebrews, of the instructive catastrophe, in short, of tragedy and of history. In the same year 146, Scipio sacked and razed Carthage. The Roman general Mummius put down a democratic rebellion in Greece and razed the ancient and wealthy city of Corinth. A few decades later, another Roman general, Sulla, sacked democratic Athens. During the long struggle with Hannibal, the Romans had been alarmed by a wave of democratic rebellions in the Greek cities of southern Italy. In every city, the populace was for Hannibal, for in the cities of her alliance, Rome had always made it her policy that men of property should govern. Like Sparta, she was wedded to oligarchy, to men who wielded a kind of force the Roman politician deeply respected: money. As for popular assemblies, a character in one of Cicero's dialogues declared that their decrees were only the howl of the needy. This distrust and even fear of the poor characterized Roman foreign policy, and it was rooted in the distrust and fear of the patricians, who effectively governed the Roman Republic during most of its history, felt for the plebeians of Rome itself. Indeed, the domestic history of the Republic is a history of legalized and usually bloodless class war. It was a war, to use the Socratic analysis of Greek city life, between two cities dwelling inside the same walls. For many decades, the patricians effectively monopolized nearly all public office, both civil and military, and only the Senate, which they dominated, could initiate laws. They alone knew the rights for propagating the gods of Rome and for learning their will. And they were scandalized by the very thought of a plebeian serving in a public priesthood. So essential were their prerogatives that they were equally scandalized by the thought of intermarriage between a plebeian man and a patrician woman. True, laws had to be approved by a popular assembly of plebeians, but votes were by tribes, heavily weighted in favor of wealth and by acclamation, since the secret ballot came only later. Moreover, since the plebeian was helpless, unless he became the client of the patrician, able to plead for him in court and otherwise protect him, there were ways of managing popular suffrage. If an election threatened to go badly, patrician priests could receive orders from the gods to postpone it. It was the plebes. If they became too difficult, the Senate was admirably placed to pick a quarrel with some other city and provoke a war. And since military service was compulsory and universal, a declaration of war would place the plebeians under stern discipline. At the great Cincinnatus allegedly declared in the very year in which the Athenians fought off the Persian Empire at Marathon, we are somehow fated to enjoy the favor of the gods in larger measure when warring than when at peace. In addition to the domestic peace that military discipline brought, war of course brought booty, movable property, including slaves, since the Romans followed the common custom to the Greeks and other ancient peoples of enslaving their prisoners, and land, the basic form of capital in an overwhelming agrarian Roman Republic. When the vanquished were forced to cede land, it became public land. The plebes naturally clamored to have it divided, but the graver patricians often preferred to keep it public, since they were powerful enough to encroach on it illegally. Finally, the plebeians were quite aware not only that they were deprived of their fair share of their profits from Rome's incessant wars, but also that they were being conscripted to force obedience to their betters when rebellion appeared to threaten. So oppressive was patrician rule and so offensively arrogant that between 494 and 287, according to the tradition, the plebeian city of the poor ceded on 5 separate occasions from the Roman Republic, thereby leaving Rome to the city of the rich. On these occasions, the plebeians withdrew to the Aventine Mount, where there was a continuity of traders. Some of the traders were Greek, who must have been perfectly familiar with the democratizing effect that commercial development had on the Greek cities. Since the patriciate could not function either economically or militarily without plebeian manpower, the successions wrung from the patricians repeated modifications of the Roman Constitution. The result was a legal state within the state, with its own assembly and its own executive officers. For the time being, Rome thereby avoided, on one hand, the bloody revolutions of the poor against the rich that afflicted so many Greek cities, and avoided, on the other hand, the democratization of its patrician government. To prevent this latter fare, the patricians were often able to bribe or persuade the tribunes, the principal officers of the corporate plebeian community, to betray the interest of their constituents. Instead of resolving class tensions by correcting injustices, the patriciate had in effect legalized class warfare and preserved public order. In the early years of the Republic, those plebeians who could afford to provide their own mounts had served in the cavalry and were hence known as equites, that is, horsemen or knights. But the equites early turned to business. They became the army, contractors, or tax collectors, or bankers, until the word equites came to mean businessmen, as distinguished from patrician landowners. The patricians confined themselves to such honorable occupation as farm, law, service to army officers, and politics. Since warfare yielded slaves, they sought either by purchase or illegal seizure and more land to exploit. Since war bought other booty, and since they were forbidden the dishonorable practices of operating a business or lending money for interest, they operated confidentially and illegally through equites. By the 1st century BC, Cicero, himself of equestrian birth, but raised by oratory to the office of consul, and therefore entitled to a seat in the Senate, believed he could prevent the bloody class warfare that had finally broken out when he was young, and formulated a plan for preventing its reoccurrence. He proposed to preserve at all cost relations between the snobbish patricians who used and despised him and the equites whose greed shocked him. He was convinced that so long as the landed interest and the money interest stuck together, the restless plebeians and their contact clamor to share the land that had been bought for Rome. I think it says they bought it with their blood. Be conciliated by a sufficiently competent orator, preferably himself with a new title, Rector of the Roman Republic. Indeed, a kind of collaboration between two propertied orders was already taking place. For example, when the noble Brutus lent money to Cyprus at 47%, he broke two laws. One of them, the limited interest on loans to 12%, and the other forbade patricians like Brutus to lend money at interest at all. The loan had to be made confidentially through businessmen. When collections of such loans became difficult, a patrician governor of a province with Roman armed forces at his command could often help Roman businessmen to enforce their legal claims. It's just like the mafia and the Vatican and all of that. During Rome's second war with Carthage, when Hannibal seemed to overthrow her control of Italy, he succeeded in making an alliance with Philip V of Macedonia. After Rome had defeated Hannibal, the Senate allowed two Greek states to get Roman help against Philip. It was this help which marked Rome's unplanned entry into the Greek world to the east. Therefore, she was through. She had conquered and organized that world. Its vast wealth provoked the civil war that the young Cicero had watched rending the Roman public. The struggle between the plebeian hero. Okay, start over. Before she was through, she had conquered and organized that world. No, I better start back up here. Okay. During Rome's second war with Carthage, when Hannibal seemed about to overthrow her control of Italy, he succeeded in making an alliance with Philip V of Macedonia. After Rome had defeated Hannibal, the Senate allowed two Greek states to get Roman help against Philip. It was this help which marked Rome's unplanned entry into the Greek world to the east. Before she was through, she had conquered and organized that world. Its vast wealth provoked the civil war that the young Cicero had watched rending the Roman Republic. the struggle between the plebeian hero, Marius, and the patrician hero, Sulla. It helped provoke the struggle between Pompey, who further completed the conquest of the highly civilized Greek world, and Julius Caesar, who conquered the barbarous West and began the long process of Latinizing it. Caesar was probably the most imaginative statesman that a signally unimaginative republic ever produced. He perceived that the Senate had conclusively proven its unfitness to govern the empire Rome had built. Educated partly in the Greek world, he could detect that Rome was moving toward the point where the Greeks had reached when their cities in Europe, Asia, and Africa fell nearly 3 centuries earlier in the rule of one man, a man whom Caesar greatly admired, Alexander the Great. Caesar publicly espoused the democratic policies of his uncle by marriage, Marius. He yielded to his political rival, Pompey, the glamorous task of pacifying the still wealthy Greek East, and again followed his uncle's example by tackling the Gallic peril. He is on record as having judged that political power in Rome could only be secured by those who disposed of men and money. He borrowed the money from Crocus, a real estate operator who had made himself the richest man in Rome and now longed to win fame as a general and statesman. Caesar, like Crocus and Pompey, and indeed all the generals of their day, enlisted a professional army with his money, for Marius had discovered the only way the plebeians could get their share of land and other booty was to serve a general who could seize both, either in a foreign or in a civil war. Caesar went to Gaul and proved that if money could buy soldiers, soldiers could also seize money. The Parthians' mounted archers disposed of Crocus, Caesar's tough veterans overthrew Pompey, and Caesar ruled Rome. When members of the Senatorian oligarchy assassinated him, his great-nephew and heir, Octavius, fought another civil war, but this one against Antony, and by 27 BC made himself the founder of the Roman Empire, the richest man in it, and undisputed master of all its armed forces. Next.